10% sometimes takes as long as the rest of it because of the fine details, but I'm happy with the progress. And at the moment I'm in my room in Palo Alto. I'm here for a few things, some editing sessions, and also some looking at some landscaping stones, materials for Audaria. Doing a little artwork there on the grounds, if you will. So that's what I'm up to. Why don't go ahead and take the questions. I can't hear you.
So far, we only have 3 questions, but I'm sure we'll get more as people come on. So the first person is Eric.
Dandavat Pranams. Good morning, Maharaj. Nice to see you.
Good morning.
So my question is regarding something I heard from Srila Prabhupada, something that I read a little while ago, wherein he says, unless we understand that this place is miserable, there is no question of how to get out of it. A person who doesn't develop this understanding is not fully developed. Just like the animals, they do not understand what misery is. They are satisfied. So those last 2 sentences especially were a bit confusing to me because, often, I've heard that, the characteristic of material life, like the prime characteristic of it is that a person's always dissatisfied, that, things never live up to their expectations, and, things that are temporary are always, dissolving and going away. Whereas if I remember correctly, in Bhagavad Gita and other places, a self-realized person is usually described as being satisfied, or, so it seemed to be a little the opposite of what I expected. So I was a little confused by that. If you could clarify.
Yeah, what Prabhupada is referring to is the fact that although material life is unsatisfying, as would be the life of a fish outside of water, nonetheless, that said, most of the living entities within the material world at any given time have not realized that fact, have not come to the point of exasperation and acknowledging the fact, and therefore living with a ongoing kind of discontent that and that kind of material exhaustion then gives them the impetus to turn towards a comprehensive solution. So a transcendentalist is looking for a comprehensive solution, and his or her intelligence thereby will be influenced by the quality of sattva. Others whose intelligence is more influenced by rajas and tamas. Rajas, for example, will be continuing to seek a problem and see temporary solutions or relative improvements, to be building upon the prospect of an ultimate solution. And so some people are, yes, there's an overall discontent, but they haven't reached the point of kind of an akinchana gotram. They're exhausted with the pursuit of finding enduring happiness in relation to things that don't endure. So yes, there's an overall discontent, but it builds up and becomes sufficient impetus for some at some point to pursue a transcendental objective. But obviously, as Prabhupada was saying, it doesn't happen to everybody, right? So they're experiencing some measure of contentment, or they think there's still a prospect of contentment, or they're settling, for what they have. The animals are settling for what they have. Of course, they're in a different situation than ourselves. We don't have to settle for it. But then again, the Bhagavatam describes most people as dvipada pashu, which means two-legged animals. Does that help?
Oh, yes, definitely. That made a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Sajan? Just have to unmute yourself.
Dandavats Maharaj.
Very good.
I sent you a question. I sent you a question just shortly after the last satsang. Did you receive that by email?
Yeah, I did. I just remember now that you sent that, and for the rest of the audience, Sajan's question was that he's writing something for a publication, and he asked me, if I recall, if there's anything that I can think of that resembles a statement from the Bible, which says something to the effect that whenever 2 or 3 gather in my name, I'll be there. Just call my name and I'll be there.
Yes.
And I wanted to reply, I was going to, I forgot, but actually, I don't know of any particular statement, but what does come to mind is a beautiful discussion between a couple of Prabhupada's disciples who had come under the good guidance and shelter of Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj one evening on his veranda. As you know, Sajan, being a disciple of Pujapat Sridhar Maharaj, that Guru Maharaj would speak with us often from his veranda in the morning and in the evening, and extensively, actually. Some days he would speak 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, and the talks were fortunately recorded. The interest of the disciples of Prabhupada and members of ISKCON who were coming to him at that time, their interest in Krishna consciousness was so acute that he felt very inspired. Once he said, if I was only had a group like this when I was younger, we could have really done something. But that said, relative to your question, and my mind went immediately there when I read your question, and there may be an answer there. I don't know where to find it, but he was talking with maybe one other devotee, maybe one disciple of Prabhupada, or two, and it was in the evening, and he was speaking, and in the course of speaking, Prabhupada came up and he began to speak about Prabhupada. And at a certain point, he became very emotional. And then he referred to a passage somewhere, and this is what you're looking for, in the writings of the Alwars. Alwars are the mystic poets who preceded the Sri Sampradaya as it was systematically articulated, its tattva, its siddhanta by Ramanuja. So what you find in the teachings of Ramanuja are there in the poems of the Alwars, very special persons who are in that sampradaya. They're considered incarnations of the different paraphernalia of Narayan, like his discus, his chakra, his club, and so on and so forth. And so somewhere in that writing, there's this he referred to this statement that very, very, very similar, that two or three, I think it was three of the mystics, maybe they were all three followers, they had to hold up in a cave during the monsoon. And there they began to speak amongst one another, Harikatha, speak about Bhagwan and so forth. And somewhere, and again, I don't know the verse or exactly what was said, but the spirit of it was that wherever the three of them gathered, two or three gathered and spoke about him, he was present, so they felt his presence. And Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj is saying this in the context of speaking about Prabhupada.
Wow.
And what he was saying is that Prabhupada is present. I feel his presence. Here we are, two or three of us together, speaking about him, and he's actually present here. It's very like to hear. I wasn't there personally, but I heard it on the tape. It just make your hair stand on end. Very, very exciting. So the principle is there, and you might, yeah, you're what you're writing for probably doesn't require a verse and a number necessarily. So you could use that maybe in some way to give a cross-cultural reference from Christianity to Hinduism.
Yes, thank you, Maharaj. I'm so extra delighted that my question brought your response not only to the cave of the Alwars, but brought you to the veranda of Srila Guru Maharaj.
That's right, and Prabhupada. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much again.
Haribol.
Haribol.
Okay, Brigu? What's going on with them? We're not hearing you, Brigupad.
Can't see, can't hear.
Yeah, let's see. Sargahi? Oh, there she is. She's trying to do something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dandavat Guru Maharaj.
Hi, Hare Krishna.
We had a question here from one of our members here in our group about laukika sraddha and sastriya sraddha. If you could elaborate on the difference between these two. And then also regarding to the previous question, we thought of this verse, Naham tishtami vaikunthe yoginam hridayeshu cha yatra gayanti mad bhakta tatra tishtami narada. I am not present in Vaikuntha, I am not in the hearts of the yogis,
Right.
but where my devotees sing, there I'm present. So that
Right,
might be
so-
something for Sajjan Prabhu.
A good reference for Sajjan. Yes, that's a famous verse. Nam Vaikuntha
Yes.
Tishtami.
So that might
Where is that found?
Yeah, where is that verse? It's a Puranic verse, right? Aham Tishtami Vaikunthe Yoginam Hridayeshu Va. I'm not in Vaikuntha. I'm not in the hearts of the yogis. I am wherever my devotees are chanting my name. I'll look it up, the reference, and send it to you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you for that, Prabhupada. Regarding your question, thank you for that. Of course, laukika means worldly, and Shastra here refers to that which speaks about that which we could not know about or understand with our limited resources of physical, mental, and intellectual. This is the main purpose of the Shastra or the sacred texts. While the sacred texts do speak about things that we could know with our material faculties, those things are only things that are employed in speaking about that which we could not know with those limited resources. That's a fairly important point, because it draws upon the relative, as it must, to speak about the absolute to those who are conditioned materially and are living in, the relative world, if you will, of comings and goings, here a day and gone tomorrow type of experience. So it's important then to sort out what information there is being employed to speak about something which we could not know otherwise. In other words, let's say, for example, we draw, in order to do that, we draw on an analogy to help conceptualize. And the analogy is dealing with something in nature that was thought to be true at the time. But with the investigation of the natural world with more penetrating instruments and over a longer period of time, you might see that nature works differently than was thought of at that time. As in the future, we may see nature works differently than we think of it does now. So there's may be some relativity in the analogy, but what it's speaking to say about that which is beyond the ken of our material instruments, nonetheless holds true. Just a point as an aside. So the main purpose of the scripture is to speak to us about that which we could not know otherwise. That's what revelation means. If we want to know perfectly, or if we want to acquire perfect knowledge by which we could become perfectly happy, we need a perfect method. So this is the perfect method, as I sometimes say. You have to fold your hands. You asked that we are in imperfection. We want to know perfection. So if perfection chooses to reveal itself to us, then we will know. But from within imperfection, we can't bring about perfection. This is the idea. So laukika sraddha, or worldly faith, in one sense, could refer to faith that is born under the modes of nature. Krishna speaks about this in the Gita. I forget which chapter, 17th chapter, perhaps. And I think Arjun's question is, what is the nature of faith, and what is the result of faith that people have in God that's not drawn from the scripture? It may be well, India's fond of making up gods and goddesses as they go along. For example, in the Bhagavat, another example, Krishna asked Krishna asked Nanda Maharaj, his father, that you're performing this sacrifice for Indra. Does it have any basis in scripture, in the disciplic succession through the sages through which the Shastra is passed down, or is it just I'm looking for the word, is it just a local superstition amongst the people, and so on and so forth? So Krishna in the Gita, referring back to that chapter, then speaks about faith in this mode, under this mode of nature, under that mode of nature. And in the end, he says, of course, Yashastram vidimutri vartate kamakarta nasa siddham avapnoti nasukam nam param gatim. That faith in God that it's not, and in the subsequent action, because if we have faith, we can go forward, right? It's the animating principle in life. And Krishna points that out in that chapter. Shraddhamayo ayam purusha. A person is their faith. It's the animating principle, the contrasting statement poetically of Sridhar Maharaj. Suspicion leads to suspension. So if we're suspicious, our animation is suspended. So if people are moving according to their faith, in some sense, they are their faith. And if that faith is born out of the modes of nature, it's going to have a corresponding result, which is less than transcendental. If that faith comes from the nirguna, from beyond the governing modes of the world, the modes of nature, sattva, rajas, tamas, then it can have a transcendental effect. To go from the Bhagavad Gita to the Uddhava Gita, where Krishna is speaking to Uddhava, Krishna goes a step further when he says, tamasic faith is like this, rajasic faith is like this. I forget exactly what he says. Sattvic faith is faith in the scripture, and transcendental faith is faith in me. Sattvic faith is faith in the efficacy of scripture, but then to get to actual understanding of bhakti, and you could say there's a difference between all the Puranas, for example, and the Bhagavatam, right? Amalam pramanam, amalam puranam, yad vaishnavanam priyanam, such as the Bhagavatam. Nigama kalpataro galitam phalam. Of the tree, metaphorically speaking, of Vedic knowledge, which is many branched. You were talking about scripture has many branches of knowledge, right? The ripened fruit, which falls from the tree, phalam, nigamakalpatura galitam, phalam galitam means fallen. So the tree, the Bhagavatam is so nice because it's the ripened fruit of the tree of the Vedic literature, and you don't have to risk much to climb up and pick it. It falls down. Yeah, and then it's tasted by Sukadeva, and he passes it. It's even sweeter. He adds to it, so forth. It's a very compelling verse. Probably, maybe my favorite verse of the Bhagavatam, the third verse of the first chapter of the three introductory verses. Nigama kalpataro galitam palam sukamakadamatadravasambhitam. So it implores us, you should taste that fruit and it will make you pass out. And what should you do when you get up? Taste it again, drink it again. So we could say even faith in Shastra is general, it's sattvic. The symptom of sattvic faith is that it brings knowledge. But knowledge corresponding as it does with sattva guna is insufficient in of itself, even for transcendental result. For that we need, as I say, ingress or input from the nirguna side itself, and such is the nature of Uttam Bhakti, which is the subject of the Bhagavatam. So there may be general faith in God, there may be superstition. There are books like Conversations with God I mentioned the other day. Probably not a good thing to read. What somebody's imagination is, and so on and so forth. Whereas faith that's derived from revelation revelation is really, and scripture being a prominent expression of that revelation, is really an invitation from the absolute for having a conversation. Pujapa Sridhar Maharaj used to refer to the pranava omkar, the primal sound of the scriptures, as an affirmation. Yes. In other words, human life itself is a question. Why? Why? It's a qualitative question. So qualitative questions are not about the natural world, which is quantitative in nature. It's about consciousness, which is spooky, okay? Qualitative. You can't measure it. It's the measurer. A ruler can't measure itself. It's of a different nature altogether than that which is measured. Maya is that which can be measured, or the thought that I can measure it all. So the qualitative question, the Atma in human life, the self has risen out of the clutches of the confines of material nature enough to ask about itself. That's what why means. Why do I exist? There seems to be a purpose that transcends or goes beyond what meets the eye and the mind. In fact, as I often say, now the Olympics are playing out in Japan. This is all about going 1/10,000th of a second faster, or exceeding the limitations, what were thought to be the physical limitations. We have this sense as humans that we shouldn't be limited. This is, from our perspective, this is the Atma feeling itself. So human life is the question. It is a question. Why? And the scripture is the answer. Let's talk about it, Krishna says. In other words, you can't get that answer from material nature because it's quantitative in nature rather than qualitative. So if you want to know about consciousness, you have to ask from consciousness. You can't ask the unconscious for information about consciousness. Right? So the spark has to turn towards its source, and revelation is the source, if you will, speaking about it itself. And in the broadest sense, the pranava omkar, as Pujapa Sridhar Maharaj says, is an affirmation. What you're looking for, that there's more meaning and purpose. I agree with you. There is. Yes, it's a fact. And that's heartening. Then there are thousands of other statements to point out that you're looking in the wrong direction for it. And what's the right direction to look in, and so on and so forth. So, so faith derives from the absolute reaching out to us and providing information about itself is categorically different than faith that we may arrive at simply through the exercise of the functions of our material conditioning. In other words, our bodies, our minds, our intellect are all products of karma, which are all the problem that we find ourselves in, bound up in the action reaction of karma. So they're not suitable instruments for getting beyond themselves, unto themselves. And they may be used in relation to revelation. Obviously, we use our mind, we use our intelligence, we engage ourselves physically according to the suggestions of the sacred texts and so forth. That way they have utility, but unto themselves, they don't afford us the purchasing power for real estate and transcendence in a land beyond death. So therefore, as I say, in the chapter of the Gita that I referred to at the beginning of my answer, it talks about different types of faith. Krishna says, Yasastram lidimutstritscha vartate kamakarta, na sasiddhim avapnoti, na sukham, na param gatim. So that faith, the animating principle, which causes us to move, that is not derived from revelation, that's not going to bring you siddhi, perfection, nasukam, not paramgatim. It's not going to ultimately make you happy and enable you to attain paramgatim, Vaikuntha, the supreme destination. Does that help? I can't hear anybody on the other side.
I'm here.
Brigu is there?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, is it up?
All right.
Okay, so we have a question on the chat from Annapurna, and it's in Spanish. Can you see it, Somacinda? Yeah, because she sent it to me directly, and I can't read it because I'm not knowing it. What I'll do, let's see if I can just copy it. So I will do that.
Guys, just to refer back to Sajjan for a moment, Sajjan, if you can look on the comments, there must be something, the verse that you're looking for is cited there.
Yes, I see it right now. I see it. Thank you so much
Okay.
to Indira Bahya and those devotees who have helped out. So thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, you should be able to.
Not clear on the question that there are thousands of ashrams in Navadvipa. Maybe you mean the islands. Navadvipa refers to 9 islands, and if you, assuming that that's what she means by the question, then the 9 islands are named from based on local circumstances, environment, and happenings, and so forth. And I think that the details of that are is explained in Navadvipa Bhavataranga of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and or Navadvipa Mahatmyam, also by the same author. And I don't remember all the Srimanta Dweep, Godum Dweep, Rudra Dweep, and so forth. How they got those particular names, but there is either some pastime or some prominent feature of the island that causes it to have the name. The bigger picture, of course, is that they correspond with the different angas of bhakti given by Prahlad in Srimad Bhagavatam, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Padasevanam, and so forth. So that's the best I can do, is refer you to those texts of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and I believe he gives maybe a pastime, or as I say, a prominent feature of each of those geographical, if you will, as they appear. They're not limited to geographical area, but appearance of such limitation for Leela, some prominent feature of that sacred geography that gives birth to the names.
Okay, we have a very unusual situation today that we have run out of questions. So does anyone who's on the call that didn't tell me they had a question have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it.
I have a question.
Oh, good.
Yes,
Go for it.
good morning.
Dandavats. I was interested in hearing from you how you would justify in modern terms what modern science is seeing in space as far as it seems unlimited universes with the descriptions that we have in the Bhagavat. How we would make some, what would be your ideas in regards to that? Because it seems that their classifications of universes and the Bhagavat's classifications of universes being a shell covered by layers by the different elements would be hard to reconcile.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have thought about that a little bit, but there's probably a couple of ways to think about it. First of all, the Bhagavatam speaks of many universes, but it's not clear what is meant by the broad term that we translate universe. Is a universe a universe as it's thought in modern science, or is it a galaxy? As this universe has, of which this universe apparently has many, according to the present modern way of investigating. Of course, there's a multiverse theory, prominent theory or hypothesis, I guess I should say, in modern science, that there are many universes, and again, whether that is what the Bhagavatam is speaking about, is not clear. Just to translate the word jagat, the world, into universe, for example, the Jagadishwar, from whom jagats come, worlds come. So anyway, many worlds. Well, I guess what I would say besides that is that the investigation of the universe, space, by modern science is something that is always turning up new possibilities, and it seems fathomless. And in one sense, it gives credibility to the idea that Krishna is appearing in different universes at different times, and there are ideas in modern science that there's a universe right here next to my left ear. There's one that's going on next to my right ear and above my head. Well, I don't even know what all that means, to be honest with you, from a scientific point of view. But it's very esoteric, the way it's spoken of. So in one sense, the way it's talked about broadly makes for this like a magical, type of outer space, if you will, or space that we're all contained within. But your question seems to refer, if I understand it correctly, more to the idea, well, here's, these are so many planets, and that's all that are described. And then, of course, then there's the coverings and so forth that aren't talked about at all in the Bhagavatam, or should be in modern science. Those coverings and all that description is from the Sankhya. So the Sankhya, it was the dominant way of looking at the natural world that was drawn upon from the Buddhists in their texts, Hindus, and others. And the Bhagavatam incorporates the Sankhya perspective of nature, of what's out there. The counting Sankhya of the different, of all the, it's all made up of, if you will. And it then incorporates that Sankhya philosophy or theory into its text, the Bhagavatam, in its own way. So if you take the Sankhya philosophy, Bhagavatam adapts it in part, and then it actually how would I want to say the Sankhya philosophy is not theistic, so the Bhagavatam turns it into a theistic. It takes that model, uses it, but what for? To make the point ultimately that the whole thing is, in order for it to run as it does, the world requires consciousness behind it, and ultimately even the sparks that make it go, the jiva, are, well, sparks of the fire, supreme consciousness behind it. That's not part of the Sankhya philosophy. So in that sense, the main point that the Bhagavatam is putting out there is that there's God, there's consciousness. Consciousness is not limited by time and space. It makes the whole of material nature animate. It animates it. And it deposits subtle form of matter and a gross form of matter. Now, these things, a gross form of matter and a subtle form of matter, those can come into discussion of modern science. It tends to dismiss subtle matter, but in trying to understand consciousness and reduce it to gross matter, it's having great difficulty. So a good number of people in the scientific community are starting to posit the possibility of a subtle form of matter, or that their consciousness underlies everything, and so forth. And so these are, I realize this is beyond what you're asking precisely, but it's related. And the point I'm making here is that Bhagavatam is speaking about the natural world in a way that in some senses is relatable to the findings of modern science, especially as science tries to look at and understand consciousness. Otherwise, one way to answer your question is that, well, the Bhagavatam's imported the contemporary perspective on the natural world, which was the Sankhya perspective, into its fold, with the purpose of speaking about that which, as I said earlier, we could not know otherwise, about the nature of the Godhead, Bhagawan, and definitively, for that matter, about the nature of consciousness, of which we are also constituted, and so forth, which would then make the Sankhya perspective relative. And I think that Bhaktivinoda Thakur would look at it like that, if need be, and say, well, the Sankhya talks about the world like that, modern science talks about the world like this, pick which one you want. But in either case, what's important is that consciousness is driving the whole show. And that is tenable. That idea is something that has power, even in the modern narrative, as to the nature of the natural world. Now, of course, I have written about this in my book, Sacred Preface, and there are some, I mentioned there that there are some people who have looked at the Sankhya perspective on the world and feel it has more credibility than it would seem to the uninformed person who hasn't explored it more in greater depth, and at the same time doesn't have much depth in modern science. So there are some who have looked for kind of a fusion, if you will, between this ancient idea of the natural world and the modern ideas, and found that there's that they can benefit from one another. I'm not an expert in that. If you go back more directly, precisely to your question, one of the things that is important, I think, to consider is when you look at the Bhagavatam and you look at the planetary systems and the coverings that are said to be the coverings of the nature, earth, water, fire, and so forth. From there, look at Srimad Bhagavatam, and what we're really talking about is different planes of consciousness. So when Prabhupada was going to build, for example, in Mayapur, a planetarium based on the Bhagavatam to compete with the modern scientific perspective, which was not theistic, Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj recommended build it like Srimad Bhagavatamrita, rather than like physically, this is what's happening here, this is what's happening there, and so forth. So the whole thrust of the Bhagavatam is consciousness. Consciousness is primary. Consciousness is behind everything, right? Everything is consciousness in a sense. Even your body is your consciousness. You are your body. From that perspective, your present state of consciousness is expressed in relation to the material world, and the material world takes that shape. So consciousness behind everything, right? Gross matter is evolving out of subtle matter. That has credibility. That theory, which is the Vedic theory, or the Gaudiya Vedanta theory. But in Srimad Bhagavatamrita, we're getting the nectar essence of the Bhagavatam, and Sanatana Goswami is taking us to different planes of consciousness. And I think that that's more essential and relevant way of speaking about the world. I mean, he does talk up there about earth. He does talk about the coverings of, those material coverings, but he's talking about them as as realms of conscious experience. For Gopakumar, for example, enters into the earth element. He meets the goddess Bhumi and Braha, the boar avatar of Vishnu. So it's not like earth, fire, you light a match. It's much more to it. And again, the Bhagavatam is speaking about it as planes of conscious experience. There's apparently entities living in the earth element. So it's useful to look at it all as far as possible from the Bhagavatam's perspective. And then I think that you're not really looking at this two competitive ideas that are talking exactly about the same thing. They're looking from an entirely different angle with entirely different worldview. When you try to make them as competing narratives per se, literally, it kind of breaks down. And who understands each of them? Someone may understand modern science very well, but have a very superficial understanding, if at all, of Sankhya, and vice versa. Or one might have a very deep understanding of either one. Again, the idea that consciousness is primary, we're a unit of consciousness, and there are different planes of experience that correspond with different levels of God consciousness or the individual conscious entity coming in the proximity of its source, and then seeing the world from that vantage point and so forth. Then I think that's maybe a better way to look at what's being described there in the Bhagavatam, in terms of the coverings and the universe and so forth. Again, to look at them as just competing narratives is kind of where the question arises out of, and I don't think that's the way to approach it. And my reference to Brihad Bhagavatamrita, which is a whole different way of thinking about it, right? Planes of conscious possible experience that through sadhana one can come to. I hope that helps. I'm open to your further questions or thoughts. Dulal Chandra.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Okay.
So Sajan has another question.
I mean, again, just to say that once again in another way, the whole thrust of the Bhagavatam is to use the natural world, talk about it in such a way as to promote the position of the personality of God and that of the jiva. So that's its purpose. So how it talks about it is for that purpose. What modern science is talking about is for a different purpose. Sajan, your question?
Yes, thank you, Maharaj. Earlier you mentioned the collective body of the Puranas, out of which, of course, the Bhagavatam is supreme, we consider. Have you ever explored there's quite a substantial portion, the final portion of the Brahma Vaivarta Purana is all apparently about Radha and Krishna. And even Radha is mentioned directly by name, unlike the Bhagavatam. Have you ever explored that, or do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I do. First of all, when you say, as you did, we say that Bhagavatam is the, supreme Purana and so forth. Actually, it's not just we, it's very objective. Of course, Jiva Goswami spoke about it in his Tattva Sandarbha, very systematically, showing the relevance of the Bhagavatam and how it exceeds the relevance of all other manifestations of the sacred text. But that whole argument aside, just looking at it from a modern point of view, the Bhagavatam's popularity, the Bhagavatam has been translated into so many different languages. There are I think over 80 Sanskrit commentaries on the Bhagavatam. It's been, all over India, the Bhagavatam is known, and all the Sampradayas and the rest of the world knows about the Bhagavatam. I mean, who knows about the Brahma, Purana, or this Purana or that, a little bit here or there, but there's no comparison. And from a literary point of view, the sophistication of the language and the theology and so forth, there's just no comparison between the theology and the philosophy, the richness of it, the nuance of it in the Bhagavatam compared to any other Purana. They just don't compare. It's of a different class altogether. So you can make a whole argument even from the modern point of view, and there wouldn't be too many people that would argue against it. No, this Purana is better, more significant. You couldn't make a very good argument for that. And of course, Jiva Goswami's perspective is that they're speaking according to different modes of nature for different people, which is a very interesting point because it speaks about quite an extensive measure of relativity to the scripture. Because first you might hear it's absolute, the scripture, but it's full of relativity. So here's a book, a Purana, that's for the people in them, primarily influenced by Tamaguna. Here's one primarily influenced by Rajaguna or Sattvaguna. They're going to say different things. They're going to seem to contradict. He's resolving these contradictions in ways that modern people say, well, these are just competing authors, for political purposes have written their Puranas, in certain ways. So obviously has a different perspective on it. So that said, what was your question now exactly again?
Whether you were a little bit familiar with that rather large portion about Radha.
Oh, the Brahma Vivarta Purana. Okay, the Brahma Vivarta Purana. Yes, the Brahma Vivarta Purana. Also, you can find mention of Radha in the Padma Purana, perhaps Vishnu Purana. You can find names of different participants in the Braj Leela that aren't in the Bhagavatam, and so forth. But these Puranas, the difference is there's no rasa in them. You can't read them and have, through reading, the prospect of being drawn into the Leela in such a way as to have affinity for that. Like when Jiva Goswami rewrites the Bhagavatam Leela, the Prakat Leela, in his Gopal Champu, at the very end of Gopal Champu, he says, so I have step by step gone through the pastimes, whichever one inspires you of these different rasas. He said, I've gone through the Prakat Leela, the manifest Leela, is also called the Kram Leela because it goes through different steps. So Krishna's born, Krishna passes through his childhood, he becomes to boyhood, he goes to adolescence, and so forth. The Uppercut Leela is not like that. All those are there, but in different prakashas and different windows and so forth. So the Kram Leela is more human-like, right? It goes through the whole. So he's laying down the Prakat Leela. He says, I've given it step by step, and I've discussed all the different rasas. Pick which one inspires you and enter into it. That's what he says. And so what he's done is, and the other Goswamis, of course, in their Leela Granthas, they've done what the Bhagavatam does, and they've done it exponentially. They increased it to speak about the Leela in such a way as that one can be drawn into it and develop an attraction for one of the rasas, the principal rasas. Like the Bhagavatam, as I said, it has three basic centers. It has the Vatsalya center, the Sakya Rasa center, and the Madhurya Rasa center. Vatsalya Rasa means it's 2, 3, 4 chapters surrounding the Damodar Leela. And the Vatsalya of Mother Yasoda is brought out. And then you have beginning with, kind of at the end of the 11th chapter of the 10th canto, and then end of the Brahma Vimohan Leela, and a few others. This is the Sakya Rasa center. And of course, you have the 5 chapters of the Rasa Leela, so forth. So these are like, here we're going with a story, and boom, we're going to really get into it right here, Vatsalya Rasa. We're going to go a little further, and then we're going to really zoom in here on Krita Punya Punja, what is the Sakya Rasa, and Sukadeva's hairs are standing on end. And then we're going to the Rasa Leela, and he can't even mention Radha's name. He's so ecstatic. So while there may be some details from other Puranas, and the Goswamis will draw upon the details and put them in their commentaries, along with the feeling that the Bhagavatam is seeking to and successfully conveys. So like you can read in Brahma Vivarta Purana, here's the pastime. This happened, verse next, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's kind of like encyclopedic, you know, it's just like a list. It's not playing it out in the same way and in giving access to the reader to enter into it and extract from it the feeling. And as I say, the Goswami's books are, Leela books are taking that lead of the Bhagavatam and taking it further, and then adding the names from the other Puranas and so forth, the details that might not be there. And sometimes it's thought in this regard that, well, Sukadev didn't have time to cite all the names and details because he's too busy just trying to give the feeling of it, something like that. That's the way of talking about it. So, hope that helps.
Oh yes, that was an extraordinary comparison between the two, and I never realized it was that the contrast was so dramatic like that. Thanks so much for explaining that.
Yes, thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think
Looks like we're out of time for today.
out of time. Okay,
Yep.
Thank you all for your
Thank you
questions.
so much, Gumaraj.
Next week we'll get together. I think it's, what is it, the disappearance of Pujapachita Maharaj?
Yes, next Sunday, Gumaraj
Talk
will be
about that.
giving a talk on Sridhar Maharaj's Tirobhav. Okay, so just stay on
Okay.
for just a minute and we'll do
Haribol.
some announcements. Haribol, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so for next month, we have some special classes that I want everyone to note down. Guru Maharaj will be speaking next Sunday. It'll be the same time as questions and answers. So we won't have questions and answers. And then the Sunday, the 22nd of August, he'll be speaking on Baladev Purnima. And then Monday, the 30th, these are all the same time, 11:30 Eastern Daylight Savings Time. Monday, the 30th is Janmashtami, and Guru Maharaj will be speaking then. And then Tuesday, the 31st, he'll be speaking on Srila Prabhupada's appearance. So those are the upcoming classes. And then every day of the week, we have class now. Unfortunately, it's not they have July's classes in this month, in this last, so I don't have the August classes right on hand, but they're all on Sri Chaitanya Sangha. Tomorrow is Brahmara Gita, that one I remember, and that Pamanava Swami will be giving that class. And there are a couple new classes this month, so check out Sri Chaitanya Sangha to see what that schedule is. And we'll see everybody soon. And it was wonderful having everybody on and seeing the Finland Yatra getting on. That was very sweet. So have a great day or week or until we meet again. Hare Krishna. Hi.